have there's public comment. But there again, I'd like you to keep these nice and short and to the point because we're not going to spend more than an hour for this. That's how we do workshops. So if you would like to just make a short comment tonight, now will be the time. Otherwise, we're all just here to learn. We're learning, you're learning what our planner or attorney has come up with on this Senate bill that we have to deal with. So if there's anybody who would like to just make a short comment before we get underway with the presentation, just a short comment.
Do you want me to come up? Good evening, Mary Flowers, Citizens for Better Flathead, 135 South Main, Kalispell. One of the questions I have for you comes from the article that appeared in the Hungarian News, regarding the dissolution of the extraterritorial jurisdiction.
I think that will be answered in the presentation.
Can I frame my question for it then?
Okay, with that, like I said, that information will come out in our presentations.
Good. So one of my questions on that is, where is the requirement under Senate Bill 382 that be dissolved? Haven't been able to find a citation that would require that. You are required under current state law to plan for annexation, and so planning for that joint area still has significant merit in this plan, even if you decide that for some reason you want to dissolve that interlocal agreement. But I don't see that there's any requirement that you dissolve that interlocal, and so I look forward to discussion on that.
We'll forward that to the planner, and he'll answer that in his presentation. If you have any other questions, specific questions?
Question would be a kind of a timeline in terms of if you are looking at that, dissolving that, where would it be in your priorities in terms of this timeline? Also would like to know, I know this is a very costly proposal for cities to deal with because you have to put together a lot of data, and if you've been looking at options to fund some of that, that would be interesting. Timeline, again, on the fact that Senate Bill 382, as I understand it, compliance with it is not until after the next legislative session, and part of that is to require that, to allow that if it's some of the first cities move forward with this, if they found problems with it, that it can be amended, and so that by the time you have to actually comply with the bill, then you may have an opportunity to amend it. And so I guess I would like to know, you're one of the smaller cities required to do this. Are you going to wait and follow the lead of like Kalispell or Columbia Falls or some of the other cities in the state to see what issues they run into? If you can give us a kind of a starting point.
I understand those questions, and they will be answered.
I appreciate it.
Anyone else? Are we ready for a presentation?
Shirley Fultwine for the Upper Plaza Neighborhood Association, 285 Shooting Star Drive. I just have some quick questions. Ms. Flowers' questions were mine too, but there's been some different responses to these questions, wondering when does this bill go into effect, or what parts go into effect when, and then also what will be the city's timeline for implementing all of this, including, as we have pointed out, that all of the planning, the public comment period is at the front end of the process. So the public needs to know when we can participate.
I can answer that question. It plainly shows that the public will be involved in all that planning. It has to happen. So that's something that I want you to be concerned about. That will happen in the fall. Anything further?
And also some question about whether our city-county planning board will still continue to be as is, or if it's eliminated or whatever.
I know that'll be answered also.
And I think it's been brought to my attention that there are some other bills that passed in the legislature that affect housing and this sort of thing. So I'm wondering how those other bills play into Senate Bill 3.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to be addressed tonight.
Okay, thank you.
Any further public comment, or can we get on? I think a lot of your questions will be answered once we have our presentation by our planner and our attorney. But if you think that you have something else specific, please come forward.
Thank you. I might. I've saved all the articles I know, and I'm still confused, so I'm really looking forward to the presentation tonight. It's going to be helpful to you guys and us.
Exactly.
My last comment is, I just have felt that I need to deeply apologize for some of the rhetoric that went on in the whole process of the subdivisions east of River. And I said some things probably on social media I shouldn't, and I'm going to apologize. And I look forward to hopefully having more unity in our community and ability to work together in this new proposal that's coming forward.
Thank you. Anyone further?
Good job, Mary.
This will be quick. My name is Bob Horn. I just want to make a quick follow-up on what Mary said at the beginning. As you work through this, I encourage you, and I'm sure you will, to take note of things that you would like to see changed in this bill, because she's correct. The full package will not become effective until after the 2025 session. We have the sponsor, Senator Forrest Manville, on record saying that he's open to amendments to this bill in the 2025 session. So keep that date in mind as well. The date will be sometime in probably starting fall of 2024 when they'll start drafting legislation for the 2025 session. So please, as you work through this, keep that in mind. I would encourage you to coordinate early and often with your colleagues in Whitefish and Kalispell. They're going through the same thing as you are. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone further? All right. I think at this time, which one of you would like to kick off? Want to go to Susan first, or what?
Do you want me to? Sure. Mayor, council, members of the community, as we start this process, I put together just this short history of planning and zoning in Columbia Falls. The Columbia Falls zoning was handled by the Flathead Regional Development Office, most commonly known as FERDO, through 2001. And then after the county commissioners disbanded FERDO, the three cities created the Tri-City Planning Office. And our city participated in the Tri-City Planning Office from 2001 to 2005. At that time, the other cities, their planning activity had grown to the point where it wasn't possible to also manage our planning activity. And so then from 2005 to 2008, the city had a contract planner, and we had the contract planner through that road policy update and the River Road neighborhood plan that wasn't adopted at that time, but through that process. So we had the contract planner, and then planning really fell off. In 2009, there were just 3 planning board meetings, 4 in 2010 and 3 in 2011. I mean, we weren't doing a lot of planning. And at that time, then city manager Bill Shaw just did the planning applications. And then when Bill left the city in 2011, and I took over the position, we brought on a contract planner and have had a contract planner since that time. So with our budget capacity in concert with our planning activity, we we don't have the capacity to have a full-time planner or planning office. It's quite similar to what we do with building, right? We contract with Whitefish for those certifications. So Columbia Falls is the smallest of the 10 cities that they'll discuss that's subject to Senate Bill 382. Laurel comes in next, and Laurel is also served by a contract planner. The other 8 cities that you're going to see on here are large and have large planning staff. And so our starting point is the Montana Subdivision and Plating Act enacted in 1973, that in theory granted control of subdivision development to local governments. That was the big push. And since that time, since 1973, every legislative session, there's been bills to further define or take away that control. This session was particularly unique in that there are a lot of bills that changed our control. But so we are a small city. I will address when we talk about some funding that might be available and how we as a smaller city are going to handle this, but the legislature did address some of that. So that's planning in Columbia Falls. And I showed you that little graph of what that plan is, and it literally fell off. So that's where we are, and that's how we ended up here today, subject to Senate Bill 382.
So I know Eric and I have both spent hours in seminars and planning presentations and continuing legal education seminars over the last few months, listening to presentations by various people like seasoned defense attorneys for cities and counties and the executive director of the Montana League of Cities and Towns, as well as some planners throughout the state on this legislation. I'll make a few comments first. I'm going to basically walk through this PowerPoint that is a modification and adaptation of a PowerPoint that was used at the Montana Defense Council, the MMIA Defense Council Summit back in October. Mostly, we've lifted and extracted the sections specific to Senate Bill 382 because we covered all the other land use bills as well. We're not going to talk about those tonight. But before we jump into it, just make a few comments. There are other cities within that list of 10 that are indicating that they're much further along the process. They're within months of adopting all of this, appointing their planning commission, land use plan, new subdivision regulations, new zoning regulations. And I just want to remind you that, for instance, the city of Whitefish, their last growth policy update was in 2007. Since that time, we've updated our growth policy 3 times. The Planning Commission is the body that would make any recommendations on growth policy updates. So once we get that Planning Commission appointed, then they'll be looking forward to the next growth policy update or the land use plan. We need the roadmap from the Department of Commerce. We need to follow it to see how other cities do it. So if someone gets, in other words, a city gets sued for adopting a land use plan or subdivision regulations, zoning regulations that aren't necessarily in compliance with either the act or the Montana Constitution, and they get sued, it's them that gets sued, not us. We can see what others have done wrong and learn from their mistakes. So it's certainly beneficial to us to take advantage of resources like the Community Technical Assistance Program so that we don't have to expend extra resources on our contracted services like legal and planning. Those cities with more resources and full-time planning departments and full-time city attorneys can model some of that for us. Other cities are well into the process of updating
We can't
their
hear
growth
you
policies.
very well.
Dustin, please speak up just
Sure, yes. Other cities were well into the long process of updating their growth policies when 382 was proposed. And so they were much further along the way in getting to where they needed to get than we were because we had so recently adopted our new growth policy. The change to the public comment portion in Senate Bill 382 is the area where we want to see what other cities do first because there is a public participation plan that needs to be developed by the Planning Commission. That's their first order of business. And that is an extremely important aspect of what they will be doing. But if we can see what other cities do, how they adopt it, how it holds up to legal scrutiny, because there will be challenges, that's beneficial to us. So there are parts of this Senate Bill 382 presentation that we received at the Defense Council Summit that are specific to site-specific development, and that's an area that we're going to, that's kind of where we're going to stop, because that's certainly under review and being vetted by the technical assistance team and in Montana Legal Cities and Towns, and they're going to provide more information to us as they proceed further into their analysis of that part of the Act. So I'll just jump into this presentation, the PowerPoint, and follow along. I'm basically going to read through this, and then Eric will add comments. I'll kind of turn to him on each slide for any additional comments he has. So the first thing that they covered with us is why do we need the changes? And as you can see, the needs that were addressed, and this was in conjunction with the League of Cities and Towns, input from NMIA and the legislature. Montana's land use and planning statutes were outdated, inconsistent with each other, duplicative, and bureaucratic. Everyone involved, from the city staff, consultants, public, and developers, were all extremely frustrated with the slow, expensive, risky process that was set forth in the statutes. There was no alignment between growth policy elements, zoning criteria or subdivision criteria, and every level of permitting had to duplicate the previous full review process. The administrative review and streamlining processes were prohibited under the current statutes, and there's no ability to rely on previous planning or analysis in permitting, so no looking back to precedent that was set forth in statute. Next slide basically shows which cities this bill applies to. Those 10 cities, other cities may opt in if they so choose. There was a whole slew of land use legislation that was covered with us by the League of Cities and Towns, and at the end of that huge list, we covered 382 and basically said if you're one of these cities that have to adopt 382, all those things are included. So, and then there's the next slide talks about when does this apply, which goes to answer some of the questions that were posed earlier by members of the public. So we must adopt a land use plan, zoning, and subdivision regulations that meet the framework of 382 within 3 years from the effective date, and the effective date was May 17, 2023. So 3 years from that date. The other choice is if we adopted a growth policy within the previous 5 years, then it's 5 years from the adoption of the growth policy. But to my understanding, ours was in 2018? 19. So that puts us in the 3-year time period from the effective date of the act. So next is why was the Land Use and Plating Act adopted to better coordinate and plan growth. It gives a deeper and more comprehensive identification and analysis of existing conditions and future opportunities and constraint. And as you read through Senate Bill 382, which is, by the way, 53 pages long, and I fell asleep numerous times reading through it. I think it's, in reading through it, the sections are well divided and they're well titled. So it wasn't that hard to find things within it. It wasn't so convoluted as a lot of the other legislation I've reviewed. But, so reading through it makes sense, and it proceeds through different parts of it in the way that you think it would. It also provides for continuous public participation, and you'll see that as we talk about the first order of business for the Planning Commission, which is to develop a public participation plan, and then a land use planning map, and then new zoning regulations and subdivision regulations. And you'll see that at every step, the opportunities for public comment are ubiquitous. They're plentiful. And that is the idea, is to, for these bigger decisions that adopt these plans, there's lots of opportunity for public comment and requirements upon the governing body and the city itself to comment back on those public comments, to provide analysis of them, and to really demonstrate that they've been taken into account.
Yeah, I'll just pipe in there that public participation plan is really the first order of business, whether it's the council adopting it or the first order of this new planning commission making a recommendation to you guys to adopt it. And there's a number of them that have been adopted around the state by some of the cities. Yeah, I think Whitefish has theirs adopted, and Helena. But for example, Kalispell they're just getting started. Kalispell Planning Office provided, a list of about 8 examples for the planning board and council to kind of mull over and get an idea of how to proceed with that participation plan. And really that plan will be used from the land use plan through the zoning and subdivision process. So each of those steps requires use of this plan and engagement with the public and reaching out for comment, whether it's charrettes, whether it's Facebook or social media, just different avenues to engage the public and gather their feedback for use to essentially adopt the policy and then the regulations that will implement those policies.
I have a question for you. So just for clarification, this committee, the planning committee, land use committee, or whatever, that we have to appoint is city residents only, correct? Because this is a city road plan? Like, please explain that.
Yeah, so I guess this kind of goes back to the question that Shirley asked, and essentially it was a question I asked the Montana League of Cities legal counsel at our planning conference that we had back in October. And essentially that question is, does the extraterritorial jurisdiction that Columbia Falls has apply in this new rule? And really, Columbia Falls is one of the few communities in the state that actually has an extraterritorial jurisdiction. As we know, none of the other cities in Flathead County has it, and really it's there's some unique relationships with some of the other communities in the state, but essentially the answer was with this growth policy legislation, we no longer will have an extraterritorial jurisdiction. Our jurisdiction will essentially apply to our city limits and any place that we think we might need to grow within the next 20 years. But if you read, for example, the zoning and the subdivision sections of 382, it basically says that until those areas are annexed, even if we show, an area as urban and we have a zoning designation picked for it, those regulations don't apply until it's actually annexed. So, so that's the way this is supposed to work.
That's a big one, thank you.
So, did I answer the rest of your question?
You did.
Okay.
So it's three, you have to have a minimum of 3 people appointed. So it's between 3 and 7 essentially, so you
Yeah,
want to
it's-
make it
it's
so
odd
you don't
number.
have an even number.
Yeah, it's an
And
odd
that
number.
comes from it, and
3,
those
5, or 7, or 9.
those folks come from the community, correct?
From our jurisdiction.
Yeah, okay.
And that, your question, Mayor, about representation from the jurisdiction, there's a few places in 382 where it makes kind of oblique mention of that, but one is in section 4 when it talks about planning commissions. It just says each jurisdiction must be represented. And so that indicates to me that those people must be from the jurisdiction where the planning, over which the planning commission governs.
Mr. Mayor, questions? That means the Board of Adjustments is gone?
Yeah, it's a consolidation. of the
Consolidation to one board then?
I will reiterate, because this question was asked in some of our meetings with the state. We will need to keep our other boards in existence until we adopt our new regulations, because if we get a subdivision that comes in between now and the adoption of a new land use plan and new subdivision regulations, we'll be the board that has the authorization to act. So those existing boards will be around for some time until we actually get an adopted under 382 comply.
Since Belgrade's spending a lot of money on this, are they going to be the lead city? Since Belgrade's spending so much money, are they going to be the lead city on this?
Well, I don't think they'll be the lead city. I think different cities like Bozeman are ahead of them. They're saying they want to adopt all this. And
Bozeman's gross now in Belgrade, not in Bozeman. So that's why we're wondering, since I was there over the weekend. Yeah.
So the next slide talks about what's in it, but we already covered that. So then the planning commission is appointed by the city council, as Eric said, and as the mayor iterated, and it is or will be a consolidation of all existing boards and commissions under the city council. Remember too, like Eric said, the existing boards must remain in effect and operative to enforce and carry out the provisions of our existing subdivision regulations. Planning Commission will be responsible for recommendations on all legislative land use planning decisions. For instance, first of all, the public participation plan, and then as you can see listed there, the land use plan and future land use map, zoning regulations and their map, subdivision regulations, and any other legislative land use plan document the local governing body designates. So their responsibility and obligation and their authority is pretty wide-reaching within the area of land use plan. It also hears appeals from any administrative decisions on site-specific developments. And then the appeals from the planning commission go to the city council and then from there to district court. The public participation plan is used throughout the framework of the Land Use Planning Act or the adopted land use plan. It must identify how the city will provide those things: dissemination of documents, opportunity for comments, public meetings, electronic communication and access, and the analysis of and response to public comments. And it has to emphasize that the public comment will be narrowed as the process moves to site-specific development. But until it narrows to that site-specific development, the Planning Commission's adoption and amendment to those things will include and has to include or be compliant with the public participation plan that the planning commission will put together. Then the land use plan. This should account for existing conditions, future estimates and anticipated use for housing, local services and facilities, economic development, natural resources, environment, and hazards. That's a pretty long list, but it's a very comprehensive plan that will take our planning commission a while to come up with, adopt that, hear the public comment, go back, tweak it, amend it, work with the technical assistance program, work with the League of Cities and Towns. It'll be a long process to work on and adopt that land use plan. Not to mention the projections for housing, population, infrastructure needs, housing needs. The future land use map, it must identify preferred and anticipated patterns and intensities of development within the jurisdiction and any areas anticipated for future annexation. It must also reflect an adequate area to accommodate the housing units and other needs reflected in the plan. So it's contemplated there that beyond the city limits, it should anticipate and look at where growth should take place, where they want it to take place, and where it can take place to meet those needs.
Yeah, it also, the implementation side of it also states where it shouldn't take place. So floodplains, steep slopes, shallow groundwater areas, those sorts of areas would be theoretically identified on the land use map.
So then let's go back to these 20-year projections. So you have to have 20-year projections for housing. So it should identify all these things, those projections. They have to take, under the statute, they have to take into account and use resources from the Census Bureau, the Department of Commerce, and several other sources, but it outlines specifically where they have to take their data or where they can and from what sources they can develop that data for these projections. So it should identify existing and projected housing needs for 20 years. It should analyze obstacles to housing development. It should identify actions to accommodate current and future housing needs. And if the future needs cannot be met, the city has to establish a minimum number of units that can be rehabbed or developed in 20 years to meet those needs. And then progress toward established goals should be documented, or it's required to be documented every 5 years under statute. So also included within these 20-year projections are projections for zoning. The adopted zoning should encourage housing. It's a main goal and objective that's reiterated throughout Senate Bill 382. The adopted zoning regulations have to include at least 5 of the following 14 strategies. So this has been well publicized, and I think most people that have been paying attention to 382 know that these cities are provided with these choices as to which of these 5 of these 14 strategies they're going to adopt. So that's part of what the Planning Commission will recommend to the City Council.
And I will state that there's at least 5 of these covered in the other legislative bills that were passed. So there's bills that require us to allow ADUs in all of our zoning districts. There's a bill that requires us to allow duplexes in all our single-family zoning districts. There's a bill that allows multifamily in any commercial district. So there's a number of bills that hit these elements that they're encouraging us to provide already. So I suppose if we weren't one of the 10 cities they would still be required by those other bills to provide those.
Eric, I have a question for you. When is the implementation of those? Since how there are other bills, when is the implementation of those other things you mentioned?
So all of the bills have different dates. Some of the bills were on the signing by the governor, they were enacted. So the typical date of legislation in action is October 1st. So some of the bills are October 1st. And then the last few bills have a January 1st designation. So I think like the ADU bill and the duplex bill might be January 1st. But the multifamily housing bill was, and commercial was immediate. So, for example, because we have to go, 382 requires us to completely rewrite our zoning regs as part of this process. Cities like Kalispell have just made it policy that any bill that was approved and effected by the legislature essentially is law. So, and we're essentially taking using the same logic. So if somebody were to come in and looking at a commercial area within our planning jurisdiction and they wanted to do multifamily, they would be a permitted use.
So any of those supersede any of our existing plan as of the implementation?
Exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Mayor, I have another question. Eric, since you were there, where's this concept of no parking requirements? I mean, you know, in some of our neighborhoods, as crowded as it is, and you put a duplex in there, what's going to happen? Arguments, of course.
Exactly. So the bill that amends the commercial zones to allow multifamily also stipulated that the maximum parking requirement that a city can require is 1 space per unit. And so other jurisdictions have just applied that to all their multifamily, which is one of the recommendations within this, the 14 that the legislature kind of came up with. And so I think a lot of these regulations came out of the governor's task force on housing. And I can only assume that they thought that, you know, requiring 2 spaces per unit, or in some instances 2 1/3 spaces per unit, essentially was eating up the land that could be used for housing. And so that's what I assumed was their reason for lowering the parking standard.
And it also, you can see that reflected in some of the other parts too, like the height requirement. It's all kind of, you can see if you look at those different strategies, there's kind of an overarching theme of encouraging cities to make use of areas within its limits, build up, allow duplexes, you know, triplexes and fourplexes, and fill in the area that's available for housing. So that list continues on the next page and then talks about the implementation of the plan. So there should be an analysis of the inconsistencies in current regulations with the plan and the map, identifying steps to bring those things into compliance with the land use plan and Senate Bill 382. A schedule should be created for adopting or amending the land use plan, and then create a schedule for updating the plan for extension of services, and adopt procedures for monitoring and evaluating progress. So then, what about update and review of the plan? Once every 5 years, the Planning Commission has to review the plan and the map to determine whether an update must be performed. And then it goes it describes in detail the steps that they have to take in order to determine whether that update must take place and the things they have to take into consideration. The planning staff will then prepare a determination regarding the new or increased impacts, if any, and the public participation and comment will be provided in that process. If there are no new or increased impacts from the original analysis, then no update is necessary. If, however, there are increased impacts, the planning staff must conduct any analysis necessary to provide an opportunity to comment on and consider all potential impacts resulting from the changes to the plan or the map. And then we come to zoning and subdivision regulations. So the adopted zoning regulations have to grant the authority to regulate these things: uses of land, density and types of uses, size, character, number, form, and mass of structures, and development standards mitigating the impacts of development as identified in analysis and review and adoption of the land use plan and zoning regulations. And then there's a reiteration of the fact that the city has to adopt 5 of those 14 housing reforms. 5 of those 14 housing reforms as identified in section 19 of Senate Bill 382. And then as far as the adoption of new subdivision regulations, it has to provide authority to adopt standards for those things. The same exemptions to subdivision review that exist now will continue to exist, but they're consolidated and made consistent. I just read through that. As far as I can tell, all of the exemptions to subdivision review that I'm familiar with are still present. Let's see, adoption and amendments to the land use plan. Planning Commission adopts the public participation plan, follows the public participation plan when it drafts and revises plan regulations maps. And then the City Council adopts the final plan, regulations, and maps. And any amendments to these documents have to follow that exact same process. So Planning Commission to the City Council for adoption. Amendment, however, may be initiated by petition, by an applicant or the governing body. And consistency with the plan and map will be made with each amendment to the zoning regulations and subdivision regulations. So these are the recommendations for the next steps. So your first order of business is to appoint a planning commission. No less than 3, no more than 9, I believe. And then draft, adopt, and implement the public participation plan for the near future. That would be the task of that new commission.
I have a question. So, am I to understand that any members that are currently on one of the boards may apply for the planning commission? Or maybe,
They may apply, and it's up to the city council's discretion as to who it. It doesn't have to be somebody from the boards, or it can be.
right.
So there are 2 boards.
As long as they're city residents, correct?
Yeah.
Thank you.
But they still would be active on both boards, or not?
Well, you have to take that into consideration because the planning commission is going to be, given its own set of responsibilities for the near future, but those other boards are still going to be acting to implement the current zoning and subdivision regulations on upcoming applications.
Is it true that, in terms of like the public participation, that the idea is that they're front-loading all the public participation in the planning of it? And is that?
Yeah, I don't know that I don't know that they call it front loading. I think it's more accurate to say that it's allowing for some administrative review of site-specific applications, but that administrative review is immediately appealable to the planning commission. right? The planning commission, the administrative granting of any applications has to be in strict compliance with the land use plan that the planning commission has developed. And the planning commission has direct oversight of those things. And any time that land use plan or public participation plan or the regulations are amended in any way, there's an entirely new opportunity for public comment. So the idea is to build all the public comment and analysis of that public comment into the plan that has to be followed.
I do have time to take one question from the audience. Go ahead.
Oh, just a quick comment, they do in fact call it front loading. That's the term that they use.
I didn't hear that.
Okay, I've heard that.
Sorry.
And the idea is that they want to get as much information as possible about the impacts, identified and considered, and hopefully mitigated and resolved, but they don't use those terms within the land use plan, so that there's then ministerial review of site-specific developments.
Thanks. That's just a
I have a
comment.
quick question.
It's got to be real quick.
It is
We're
quick.
moving up here on
I just
time.
want clarification that city residents are the only ones that can be on the planning commission, but with all of this public participation, people outside can participate in the public comments and hearings and everything.
Oh, I believe so. I mean, we have any question on that? Justin?
Yeah.
Are you done?
That's the last slide before it gets to site-specific review, which, as I said, I think is best left for another time because we're waiting for the community technical assistance team and those folks to get back to us with their analysis of that and how it works.
So I can just quickly address the question regarding resources. We've done an estimate of quantities with as you just heard, there's a lot more data involved. So we would be in that next year, 24, 25, we would have been updating our growth policy anyway, which, contracted services, in concert with updating our preliminary engineering report for water and sewer. And so with that, this component also adds an update on transportation as well as housing. The legislature appropriated funds for the Community Technical Assistance Program to provide the dashboards and data collection. So where they specify this is where you're going to get your census information, and here's your 20-year projection. They're actually CTAP, as they're called, is supposed to be actually providing that. The dashboard is not yet live. They've been working on it for 8 months. But there's going to be, CTAP is going to provide the guidance and the best practices, the templates, right? They want it, they're like, here's the roadmap. But, I say templates and model documents, but it also, they're very specific about the data that you're going to include and where it's from. So they have funding to work with the cities. There's been an emphasis on working with Columbia Falls and Laurel because we're the smaller of the cities. The CTAP team, Department of Commerce, is applying for a grant, federal grant through HUD outside of the funding that they already have that could pass down to us. So in just a preliminary estimate of what does it take to put all these components together, it would be conservatively $400,000. Now that's a lot more than we've paid in the past, and obviously it's over a couple of year time frame. So we are looking at the planning grants, although I will say 50,000 doesn't go very far, or the 20,000 our RGL grant won't go very far. But there are funds, and in concert with CPAP, that we're going to go after every dime that we can get to implement this. And that includes, for the preliminary engineering reports and that data. So they have committed, MDOC has committed to applying for funds to help us implement this, because it's not going to be inexpensive. And so I guess to say that front loading, the bottom line is that the city is putting the details in, right, as opposed to the applicant coming with a bunch of details. Now, the city has purchased that and has vetted that in advance. So they are still defining our roadmap, and here's your templates. But the 53 pages, there are some very specific, your plans, your documents, your growth policy will include all of these items, and to this degree of detail. So hence that $400,000 price tag.
Council, do you have any questions for our planners and managers? See, it's a lot of information, and I would encourage you all. I don't know if everybody ended up with this bill, but I got about 2/3 of the way through it, and it's got a lot of really good information, which you covered. Thank you, but I'd encourage you just to get over one of these and read them. I'm not really up to a lot of lawyerese, but it's got a lot of good information, and I believe this would be available to the public on a state website. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Okay, and that is Senate Bill 382. So anyone who wishes to get a copy and read this and follow along, you're more than welcome. So, like I said, any questions from you guys? No. Okay, and we'll talk about the commission appointment and stuff at the next meeting next month, and maybe make some decisions. Oh, actually, Jackie had one quick
Thank
question
you.
first. Let's keep them kind of short, we have about 10 minutes.
I spoke to the sponsor of the bill, Forrest Mandeville, on Friday, and he stated based on our 2019 growth plan, this bill would not be implemented until 10/1/28. Can Eric confirm that it is 5 years?
That's not how the plain English of it reads, but it's not how it reads at all. So I know Forrest fairly well. Ultimately, the attorney for the League of Cities who worked with Forrest on this has said ours is due 3 years from the adoption date.
In fact, she wrote this presentation, the executive director and attorney for the Montana League of Cities and Towns.
That was the only time I said, on the record, can you answer this?
I know, so we kind of went back and forth with the outline time periods, but it's hard to get around the plain English, which requires adoption within 3 years of the effective date of the act, which was May 17th. Unless they make a specific change to that language, that's.
Couple other quick questions, ma'am?
Yeah, I had a quick question. You guys, I was curious if there's a map you could show us today. You referred to lots that we'll make in the future, but if there's one that we can see either tonight on the screen or find online somewhere that just shows clearly the city limits and the extraterritorial any place we might need to.
It's right
The map is up after the meeting, you're more than welcome.
And does that include the extraterritorial areas we might need to annex within 20 years?
That's the orange, it's not necessarily annexation, it's the
So
current.
right now, our current planning jurisdiction is defined in state law as 1 mile outside of the city limits. So that's going to shrink because we would never annex all of that area in a 20-year period.
So 1 mile beyond that red line.
So is there a document online that we can look at, or just go all here and add 1 mile?
You can go to the Flathead County GIS site and it'll give you an approximation of that, or look up the growth policy map for Columbia Falls on the city's website.
Okay, I had one guy, I have actually two back there. Ma'am, you've had your chance.
Mr.
Can
Mayor,
I have, sir, would you stand up, please?
Mr. Mayor, could staff make available this presentation on the website tonight as part of the notes from the meeting?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think the Hungry Horse News reports, and I don't know what the ability you would have to getting hold of that, but.
It's got our YouTube channel.
Yeah, ma'am?
Yes, my name is Catherine Price, and I have a question about the Montana Department of Transportation, which really struggles with the working with the city in your jurisdiction, not only on Nucleus, but going up the North Fork and US Highway 2. And they restrict you with traffic lights, they restrict you with parking, snow plowing, everything. If we're gonna have to make growth changes and plan changes and jurisdiction plan changes, what is the state gonna do to help the city of Columbia Falls and its residents to work with the Department of Transportation to move toward a growth plans to implement this? We're already fighting them on just regular day-to-day. So is there something there that we're gonna have help to fight the Department of Transportation? Because they're on your jurisdiction all the way around your city.
The jurisdiction is the state's jurisdiction, and we cannot go against the state jurisdictions.
Then how can we implement this plan?
The plan does not include the highway and the highway right-of-way, if I'm
Unless we're gonna annex, unless we need to add traffic lights, we don't have.
It's still
turn
gonna, it still
signals.
has to do with they own that property, and, I don't know where you're going with it, but we can't do anything about the State Department of Transportation owning this one going up the North Fork and Highway 2.
But we can't do housing without traffic lights, we can't do housing without
That would
stop
come up
signs.
that would come up, and a lot of that would be answered before we get to the point we have in the last few by the Planning Commission putting together a plan which would show that.
And then we have to fight the Department of
I
Transportation?
don't think there's any fight going on.
Okay,
I think we're fine with them.
okay.
Anyone else? And then we'll wrap this up. In the back,
Hi, Jennifer
would you
Betts.
please stand?
Sure. Jennifer Betts. I live on Mooring Road, which is in the unzoned area off of 206, which comprises a lot of Columbia Falls zip code anyway. So is the Flathead County have to implement this? I know they already have a whole planning commission. Will they have to redo all of what they already have in place to comply with this?
The county is not subject to
They're
it.
not
The
subject-
county's not subject to this.
Okay.
It's just cities of over 5,000
Okay.
in a county more than 7,000. So it's strictly 70. 70, that's sorry.
So in other words, it's not going to give them an excuse to.
It's not going to change anything for them, except they're going to end up having our donut area. They're going to be the implementing agency in
So
that
people
donut
know-
area, unless the folks wishing to do a subdivision annex first.
Right.
If they come to the city, ask for annexation, and they're annexed, then we control the process. If not, that donut area goes away, and you're under the county's jurisdiction and the county planning board.
Okay, thank you.
Sir?
I'm assuming that this thing will continue to be looked at and maybe adjusted, or the document is kind of a final thing. But if it's a final thing, so many words that I'm common to have changed. For example, just one, they call a subdivider. We used to think it, or at least I used to think it as a developer. And these words that have changed, why change the words if people knew what they...
If you could read the mind of the legislature that did that, you would win, Clarence. I do not know, but there's a section in here that clearly defines what those words are? Is that what you're referring to, Clarence?
Yes.
In the bill, where they changed that, I mean, it's strictly to clarify farther into the document.
Yeah, the word, the one of them, just one of them was subdivided.
Uh-huh.
We used to call him a developer. Why change it unless everybody knows what a sub-developer is?
But subdivider doesn't have to be a developer, that could be you.
Oh.
That's what I've been called before, that's what I wanted to be called.
There you go. There you go. Yeah, that's the only answer I can say. And somebody wrote this up and changed the wording, and everybody agreed with it, and they all voted for it. So we have to live with it. Anything further before we close this meeting? I hope everybody understood some of it, at least, and got their eyes open a little bit, I hope. And there will be a lot of public participation as we move forward. Everything will be well advertised as required by the law, and you will always, of course, be welcome. And whoever is on that planning commission is going to have a lot of work ahead of them. It's got to be somebody pretty dedicated, so we'll be looking for that. And Mary, you have just 2 minutes.
On the planning commission appointment, will those, you can take application?
Of course.
So when you sit at the next meeting, you'll be just discussing.
Of course,
the
we'll
process.
define that the next meeting.
Thank you. And
Okay,
thank you.
thank you everybody for attending, and we'll see you in the future.